Picture, if you will, the scorching Egyptian summer of 1903, when the legendary archaeologist Flinders Petrie and his colleague Margaret Murray stood at the edge of what they believed would be another routine excavation near the ancient temple of Seti I in Abydos, only to find themselves staring down into a pit that would fundamentally challenge everything the academic world thought it understood about the rise and fall of Egyptian civilization. What emerged from beneath 50 feet of sand, silt, and the accumulated debris of millennia was not the expected New Kingdom burial chamber or storage facility that any reasonable archaeologist might have anticipated, but rather something so architecturally alien, so impossibly ancient in appearance, and so utterly devoid of the decorative flourishes that defined every other Egyptian structure from that era, that it seemed to belong to a completely different civilization altogether, as if someone had taken a structure from the dawn of human architectural achievement and buried it beneath the sands, long before Seti I's artisans had even conceived of building their elaborate temple directly above it. The moment of discovery must have felt something like what a modern excavation team would experience if they began digging beneath the gleaming floors of an Apple store in downtown Manhattan, expecting to find the usual layers of urban archaeology. Perhaps some 19th century foundations, maybe colonial-era artifacts, possibly even Native American remains, only to suddenly break through into a chamber filled with technology that made the iPhone look like a child's primitive toy, with circuitry and materials that current science couldn't begin to explain, and manufacturing techniques that seemed to suggest a level of sophistication that predated Silicon Valley by thousands of years. This is the essence of the Osirion's challenge to conventional archaeology. It is a structure that exists in the wrong place, built in the wrong style, dated to the wrong period. And yet, there it sits, undeniably real, weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, and silently mocking every attempt to force it into the comfortable narrative of Egyptian architectural evolution that textbooks have spent the last century carefully constructing. The structure that Petrie and Murray uncovered was unlike anything else in the Egyptian architectural canon, and the more they excavated, the more disturbing the implications became for anyone invested in maintaining the established timeline of human civilization. Imagine walking through Seti I's temple above ground, with its elegant columns covered in hieroglyphic texts that proclaimed the pharaoh's divine right to rule, its walls painted with intricate scenes of religious ceremonies and military victories, its proportions calculated according to the refined aesthetic principles that characterized New Kingdom architecture at its absolute zenith, and then descending into the earth to find yourself surrounded by massive blocks of red granite and sandstone, some weighing well over 100 tons, fitted together with such precision that even today you cannot slide a piece of paper between the joints, yet bearing absolutely no inscriptions, no decorations, no cartouches, no painted surfaces, nothing whatsoever that would indicate when it was built, who built it, or what purpose it was meant to serve, beyond the vague impression that it had something to do with water, given the large rectangular pool at its center, and the channels that suggested some kind of sophisticated hydraulic system that ancient Egyptian engineers supposedly had no need for and no knowledge of how to construct. The architectural style of the Osirion speaks a language that Egyptian archaeology has spent over a century trying desperately not to hear. Because to acknowledge what that language actually says would require a fundamental revision of everything we think we know about how civilizations develop, progress, and occasionally regress in ways that conventional historical models simply cannot accommodate. The megalithic construction technique visible in the Osirion's foundation, these massive, irregularly shaped stones fitted together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle, appears nowhere else in New Kingdom Egypt, which by Seti I's time had long since moved on to more refined building methods, using smaller, more manageable blocks of limestone and sandstone that could be quarried, transported, and positioned by teams of workers using the copper tools and wooden sledges that archaeological evidence confirms were the standard technology of that era. The Osirion's construction, by contrast, seems to harken back to the techniques of the Old Kingdom, or perhaps even to something older still, some pre-dynastic period when Egyptian builders allegedly hadn't yet developed the sophisticated methods they would later use to construct the pyramids at Giza. Except that this explanation creates its own impossible paradox. How could Seti I, ruling during what scholars consider the pinnacle of Egyptian architectural achievement, have chosen to build in a deliberately primitive style that mimicked construction techniques from 2,000 years earlier? And, more puzzling still, how could his workers have successfully employed these ancient megalithic methods when all evidence suggests that the knowledge required to move and precisely fit stones of such enormous size had been lost to Egyptian civilization for well over a millennium? The question of why anyone would choose to build a structure 50 feet underground in an era when temples were meant to soar toward the heavens as physical manifestations of the connection between earthly rulers and divine beings, represents yet another aspect of the Osirion mystery that conventional archaeology struggles to address with anything approaching satisfactory explanation. Modern underground construction, even with all our advanced technology, our hydraulic pumps, steel reinforcement, electric lights, and ventilation systems, remains an extraordinarily challenging and expensive undertaking that requires careful planning and sophisticated equipment that didn't exist in the ancient world, according to every orthodox understanding of technological development. Yet somehow, workers during Seti I's reign supposedly excavated a massive pit through 50 feet of sand and soil, hauled 100-ton granite blocks from quarries over 100 miles away, lowered them into this pit with perfect precision, fitted them together with tolerances that modern stonemasons would struggle to achieve, constructed walls and pillars using techniques that appear nowhere else in New Kingdom architecture, and then left absolutely no record of having done any of this. No workers' graffiti, no commemorative texts, no scenes depicted in nearby temples showing the construction process. Nothing whatsoever to suggest that this massive undertaking had happened during the reign of the pharaoh who supposedly ordered its construction. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with taking credit for their architectural achievements in a way that makes modern Instagram influencers look positively modest by comparison, covering every available surface with texts that proclaimed who built what, when they built it, which gods they honored in building it, and why their particular building project was more magnificent than anything their predecessors had managed to construct. The walls of temples, the faces of obelisks, the interior chambers of tombs, all of these spaces were covered with hieroglyphic texts that ensured future generations would know exactly who deserved credit for each architectural marvel. Seti I himself was no exception to this rule. His temple in Abydos is covered with beautifully carved hieroglyphs that leave no doubt about who commissioned it, when he lived, which gods he served, and what great deeds he accomplished during his reign. Yet when you descend into the Osirion beneath, you find nothing. No cartouches carved into granite, no painted proclamations, no hidden texts. Nothing but blank stone surfaces that maintain an almost aggressive silence about their own origins. As if whoever built the structure either lived in an era before hieroglyphic writing had been developed, or chose, for reasons we cannot fathom, to build something monumental without claiming credit for it, both of which seem fundamentally at odds with everything we know about Egyptian culture during the New Kingdom period. This deliberate absence of decoration and inscription creates what historians and archaeologists politely call attribution challenges, but what might more honestly be described as a complete evidentiary catastrophe for the conventional timeline. Because without texts or decorative elements that can be dated stylistically, the only way to assign an age to the Osirion is through contextual association with the temple above it, which is precisely the kind of circular reasoning that would be laughed out of any other scientific discipline. The logic works something like this. The Osirion must have been built by Seti I, because it sits beneath his temple, and we know it was built by Seti I because our textbooks say so. And our textbooks say this because the Osirion sits beneath Seti I's temple. Therefore, anyone who questions this timeline must be either incompetent or motivated by some fringe agenda. This is the intellectual equivalent of determining a smartphone's manufacturing date by finding it sitting on a desk in a building constructed in 1955 and concluding that it must therefore be a 1955-era device, even though every aspect of its design screams that it comes from a completely different technological era. The profound architectural schizophrenia visible at the Abydos site, this bizarre coexistence of Seti I's refined New Kingdom temple sitting literally on top of the Osirion's megalithic construction, creates a situation so historically awkward that mainstream archaeology has essentially chosen to ignore it rather than confront the implications of what it might actually mean. Imagine discovering that Michelangelo had signed his name to Stonehenge, or that Leonardo da Vinci had claimed credit for the caves at Lascaux, and you begin to grasp the fundamental absurdity of attributing the Osirion to Seti I based solely on its physical proximity to his temple above. Because either Egyptian architectural capabilities underwent some kind of dramatic regression, where sophisticated builders suddenly forgot everything they knew, or Seti I discovered something already ancient in his own time, and built his temple above it as a way of associating his reign with whatever sacred significance the older structure possessed. The questions that the Osirion raises are not the comfortable kind that archaeological conferences enjoy debating over wine and cheese, but rather the deeply unsettling kind that threaten to unravel carefully constructed academic careers and force revisions to textbooks that have shaped our understanding of ancient history for generations. How did a structure that appears to employ Old Kingdom or earlier construction techniques end up being attributed to a New Kingdom pharaoh who lived nearly 2,000 years after those techniques had supposedly fallen out of use? And why would Seti I have chosen to construct it in a deliberately archaic style that bore no resemblance to any other building project from his reign, burying it 50 feet underground where nobody could see it? What possible purpose could have motivated creating such a massive underground structure focused on water management? And why does the stonework precision exceed that of other Seti I projects, suggesting either that his best craftsmen worked on something nobody was supposed to see, or that different craftsmen with different capabilities built it at a different time? The Osirion stands today much as it has stood for millennia, its massive stones weathered by forces that modern Egyptologists insist must have been the periodic flooding of the Nile. Despite the engineering impossibilities this explanation entails, its walls still maintaining their enigmatic silence about who built them and why, and its very existence continuing to pose questions that the archaeological establishment seems far more interested in dismissing than in honestly investigating. As we prepare to dive deeper into the geological evidence that so dramatically contradicts the official dating of the Osirion, evidence that suggests water erosion patterns requiring thousands of years of exposure to rainfall in quantities that Egypt hasn't experienced since the end of the last ice age, we must confront the uncomfortable possibility that our entire understanding of when and how civilizations develop might be fundamentally flawed, and that somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, there might be structures waiting to be discovered that will force us to completely rewrite the story we've been telling ourselves about who we are and where we came from. But that conversation, with all its disturbing implications for everything we thought we knew about the rise of human civilization, will have to wait for the next chapter, where the stones themselves will testify to truths that archaeologists have spent decades trying desperately not to hear. The stones of the Osirion tell a story that makes professional Egyptologists incredibly uncomfortable. Not because the evidence is ambiguous or open to multiple interpretations, but rather because it speaks with the kind of geological certainty that renders academic consensus irrelevant and forces anyone willing to look honestly at the physical evidence to confront the possibility that everything we've been teaching about Egyptian civilization might be fundamentally wrong. When Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University with impeccable credentials, first examined the Osirion in the early 1990s, after gaining notoriety for his controversial analysis of the Great Sphinx, he approached the site with methodical scientific rigor. And what he found, carved into the massive blocks, was not the subtle weathering you might expect from 3,000 years of occasional Nile flooding, but rather the deep, unmistakable scarring that only comes from prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall over thousands of years. The kind of precipitation patterns that Egypt hasn't experienced since the end of the last ice age, when the Sahara was still green and the climate bore no resemblance whatsoever to the arid desert that Seti I would have known during his reign in the 13th century BCE. The difference between water erosion and wind erosion is not some subtle distinction that requires years of specialized training to detect, but rather something as obvious to a trained geologist as the difference between a forest fire and a flood would be to anyone examining the aftermath of either disaster, because water and wind sculpt stone in fundamentally different ways that leave unmistakable signatures in the rock itself. Wind erosion, which is what you would expect to see on structures that have spent the last 3,000 years exposed to relentless sandstorms sweeping across the Egyptian desert, creates a characteristic pattern of horizontal striations and shallow pitting, where sand particles, carried by the wind, act like natural sandpaper, gradually wearing away exposed surfaces in a relatively uniform manner. Water erosion, by contrast, especially the kind caused by sustained rainfall rather than brief flooding events, creates deep vertical channels and rounded, undulating surfaces, where water, running down the face of the stone, gradually dissolves and carries away the softer components of the rock, leaving behind a distinctive pattern that looks less like the work of an abrasive force and more like the patient sculpting of a liquid that has had centuries or millennia to do its work, carving channels that follow the path of least resistance through the stone and creating dramatic relief patterns that simply cannot be produced by any other natural weathering process known to geology. The Osirion displays this characteristic water erosion pattern so prominently that Shock, upon first seeing it, immediately recognized that he was looking at weathering that could not possibly have occurred during the reign of Seti I or any other New Kingdom pharaoh, because Egypt by that time had been arid for thousands of years, with rainfall patterns so minimal that the ancient Egyptians themselves marveled at the regularity of the Nile's flooding precisely because it provided the water that the sky refused to deliver. The last time Egypt experienced the kind of sustained, heavy rainfall necessary to produce the erosion patterns visible on the Osirian stones was during the African humid period, which ended around 5000 BCE at the absolute latest, and more likely concluded its wettest phase closer to 10,000 BCE, when the planet was still emerging from the last glacial maximum, and North Africa still supported the lakes, rivers, and vegetation that would gradually disappear as the Sahara began its transformation into the desert we know today, which creates an immediate and irreconcilable problem for anyone trying to maintain that Seti I, who died in 1279 BCE, somehow constructed a building that bears the geological evidence of exposure to climatic conditions that hadn't existed for at least 6,000 years before his birth. The response from mainstream Egyptology to this inconvenient geological evidence has been nothing short of breathtaking in its intellectual dishonesty, with prominent figures in the field, most notably Zahi Hawass, the former Egyptian Minister of Antiquities, who has made a career out of aggressively defending orthodox timelines against any challenge, regardless of the evidence, dismissing Shock's findings not through careful geological counter-analysis or by presenting alternative explanations supported by physical evidence, but rather through appeals to authority and ad hominem attacks on anyone who dares question the established narrative. The standard Egyptological response to the water erosion problem insists that the patterns Shock identified must have been caused by periodic flooding from the Nile, which supposedly rose high enough to submerge the Osirion and create the erosion patterns. Because this theory requires us to believe that floodwaters somehow defied the laws of physics by flowing upward along vertical surfaces to create the characteristic vertical channels that water erosion produces, rather than simply depositing the silt and sediment that actual Nile flooding leaves behind, and which looks nothing whatsoever like the erosion patterns visible on the Osirion. The engineering impossibility of the official explanation becomes even more apparent when you consider the practical realities of underground construction, where the water table sits relatively close to the surface. because building 50 feet below ground level without modern dewatering technology would have required constant pumping or bailing to keep the site from flooding. And yet, we're supposed to believe that these same engineers, having gone to extraordinary lengths to keep water out during construction, then deliberately designed the structure to collect and hold water in the form of the large rectangular pool at its center. This contradiction, the idea that builders would simultaneously fight against water intrusion while building a structure specifically designed to contain water, represents the kind of logical impossibility that should immediately trigger skepticism. Because it suggests either that the builders possessed groundwater management knowledge that far exceeded anything else known from New Kingdom Egypt, or that the structure was built during a completely different climatic period, when the water table was lower, and the relationship between the structure and its aquatic environment was fundamentally different from what we observe today. Modern engineering provides us with a useful framework for understanding just how challenging underground construction remains, even with all our technological advantages. Because when we dig subway tunnels or build underground structures below the water table, we require massive pumping systems, steel sheet piling to hold back groundwater, and constant monitoring to prevent collapse or flooding. The idea that ancient Egyptian workers accomplished something comparable using only copper tools and manual labor stretches credibility to the breaking point. And when you add in the requirement that these workers somehow moved and precisely positioned granite blocks weighing over 100 tons in an underground environment where leverage space would have been severely limited, the official timeline begins to look less like history and more like mythology, requiring us to accept miracles that the ancient Egyptians themselves never claimed to have performed. The stones themselves present additional mysteries that conventional Egyptology has consistently failed to address, because the massive granite blocks display not only weathering patterns inconsistent with the official timeline, but also a level of precision in their cutting and fitting that exceeds what we see in other confirmed Seti I construction projects. The joints between these enormous blocks are so tight that you cannot insert a thin blade between them, and the surfaces are finished to a degree of flatness that would be challenging to achieve even with modern tools. Yet we find no tool marks indicating what implements were used, no evidence of the bronze saws and copper drills that New Kingdom Egyptians supposedly used. Instead, we find surfaces that appear almost polished, suggesting either technological capability that far exceeded anything else known from ancient Egypt, or an investment of labor so massive that it seems incomprehensible that such effort would have been expended on a structure immediately buried underground, where the precision would serve no obvious purpose. The comparison to other Egyptian construction methods of the same supposed period reveals contradictions that orthodox archaeology has never adequately explained. Because by the time of the New Kingdom, Egyptian builders had abandoned the massive stone construction techniques of the Old Kingdom in favor of more efficient methods using smaller blocks and architectural innovations that didn't require the enormous expenditure of resources needed to move stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons. The temples and tombs built during Seti I's reign reflect this evolution toward more sophisticated but less megalithic methods, making the Osirion stand out as a bizarre regression to techniques that had been obsolete for over 1,000 years, as if the royal architects suddenly forgot everything they had learned and returned to methods that were extraordinarily labor-intensive and completely unnecessary for achieving the structure's apparent purpose as some kind of ritual pool. This apparent technological regression presents a puzzle that historians recognize as fundamentally problematic. Because civilizations do not typically abandon effective techniques and then spontaneously rediscover them centuries later, without some compelling reason that forces them to relearn forgotten knowledge. When Roman concrete formulations were lost during the Middle Ages, it took over 1,000 years for European builders to redevelop comparable materials through centuries of experimentation. The idea that New Kingdom Egyptians suddenly remembered how to work with megalithic blocks, despite no evidence of continuous practice during intervening centuries, strains credibility, even before you factor in that the Osirians' stonework exceeds Old Kingdom precision in many respects, suggesting not a relearning, but rather the application of capabilities that may have predated even the earliest dynasties. The dating methods that Egyptologists rely upon to assign the Osirian to Seti I's reign reveal the fundamental weakness of archaeological dating when applied to structures built entirely of stone. Because unlike organic materials that can be dated through radiocarbon analysis, solid stone cannot be directly dated by any method currently available. The only ways to assign an age to a stone structure are through contextual association with datable materials, through stylistic comparison to other structures, or through analysis of weathering patterns that can provide minimum age estimates. And in the case of the Osirian, every one of these methods presents serious problems that orthodox archaeology has chosen to ignore. The contextual dating is circular because it assumes the structure was built with Seti I's temple above it. The stylistic comparison fails because the Osirian doesn't match any known Egyptian architectural style, and the geological analysis suggests weathering that far predates the New Kingdom, which leaves us with a structure that cannot be reliably dated using conventional methods, yet continues to be assigned to a specific pharaoh based primarily on wishful thinking and the professional need to maintain a coherent narrative. As we stand at the edge of the Osirian today, looking down at these massive stones with their telltale patterns of ancient rainfall carved into surfaces that orthodox chronology insists were pristine when Seti I died, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that the geological evidence points unambiguously toward a conclusion that archaeology refuses to accept. Not because the evidence is weak or ambiguous, but because accepting it would require a fundamental restructuring of our entire understanding of when civilization emerged in the Nile Valley. The stones do not lie, cannot lie, because they record in their very substance the climate conditions they experienced, the water that flowed over them, the millennia of weathering that shaped their surfaces, testifying that the Osirian witnessed rainfall that fell thousands of years before Seti I was born. Which forces us toward one conclusion. Either the structure predates the New Kingdom by such a vast span that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about human civilization, or there exists some undiscovered mechanism by which desert rainfall can mimic sustained precipitation erosion, which would overturn decades of established geological science. The choice between rewriting Egyptian history and rewriting geology should be obvious. Yet Egyptology has consistently chosen the latter, preferring to cast doubt on well-established geological principles rather than admit that their timeline might be wrong. And as we prepare to examine in the next chapter how this structure's architectural features diverge so dramatically from every other Egyptian building that conventional explanations become increasingly untenable. We must keep in mind that the stones have already rendered their verdict, even if human institutions remain stubbornly resistant to hearing testimony that contradicts their most cherished assumptions. The architectural language that the Osirion speaks is not Egyptian, or at least not Egyptian in any sense that we understand from the thousands of temples, tombs, and monuments that define our conception of what ancient Egyptian architecture should look like. And this linguistic disconnect between the Osirion and every other structure in the Nile Valley presents perhaps the most visually obvious evidence that something about the conventional attribution to Seti I simply does not make sense to anyone willing to trust their own eyes over the insistence of academic authorities who seem increasingly desperate to maintain a narrative that crumbles each time someone actually bothers to look closely at the physical evidence. When you stand at the edge of the Osirion and gaze down at those massive, irregularly shaped blocks, fitted together with such precision that even after thousands of years you still cannot insert a knife blade between them, you are looking at a construction technique that archaeologists have given the evocative name Cyclopean masonry, a term borrowed from ancient Greek writers who, when confronted with similarly massive stonework at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns, could not imagine that ordinary humans had built such structures, and therefore attributed them to the Cyclops, those mythical one-eyed giants who supposedly possessed the strength necessary to move and position stones that weighed many tons, and seemed to defy the capabilities of any human workforce using the technology available in the ancient world. The megalithic construction style, visible throughout the Osirion, represents something fundamentally different from the architectural progression that Egyptologists have meticulously documented for the development of Egyptian building techniques over 3 millennia of pharaonic civilization. Because that documented progression shows a clear evolution from relatively crude structures built with rough-hewn stones in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, through the increasingly sophisticated techniques employed in the Old Kingdom pyramids, where stones were cut with greater precision, then to the Middle Kingdom temples, where architectural innovation focused on creating larger interior spaces through the use of columns, and finally to the New Kingdom structures, where Egyptian architects had perfected methods of creating grand-scale buildings using relatively small, standardized blocks that could be efficiently quarried, transported, and assembled by skilled workers following established procedures. The Osirion fits nowhere in this progression, appearing instead as an architectural fossil from some completely different tradition, or perhaps from some much earlier phase of Egyptian development that predates our current understanding of when sophisticated stone construction techniques emerged in the Nile Valley. And the fact that mainstream archaeology insists on forcing this obvious anomaly into the New Kingdom period, rather than acknowledging that it represents something fundamentally different, speaks volumes about the intellectual rigidity that has come to characterize Egyptology in the face of evidence that challenges its carefully constructed timelines. What makes the megalithic mystery even more intriguing and deeply troubling for conventional archaeological theory is the fact that similar construction techniques appear at sites scattered across the globe in locations so geographically dispersed and culturally disconnected that orthodox archaeology struggles to explain how these similarities could have emerged unless we accept either the deeply uncomfortable possibility of some common source culture that predates our current models of civilization development, or the equally uncomfortable alternative that parallel evolution of identical complex construction techniques occurred independently, despite the astronomical improbability of such convergent technological development. When you examine the megalithic platforms at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where massive polygonal stones weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together with the same impossible precision we see at the Osirion, or when you study the foundation stones at Baalbek in Lebanon, where the largest cut stones ever moved by humans form the base of what was supposedly a Roman temple, or when you investigate the underwater structures at Yonaguni in Japan, where stepped formations carved from living rock suggest human modification despite their dismissal as natural geological formations, you begin to see patterns that suggest a global phenomenon rather than isolated local developments, and these patterns become impossible to ignore once you recognize that the conventional timeline requires us to believe that all these geographically separated cultures somehow independently developed nearly identical solutions to the problem of working with massive stones, while achieving similar levels of precision, despite supposedly having no contact with one another. The architectural evolution that Egyptian structures display over 3,000 years follows a logical progression that makes perfect sense from an engineering perspective, with pyramid construction progressing from Djoser's step pyramid to the refined geometry of Khufu's Great Pyramid, and then declining in scale and quality as resources became scarcer, while temple architecture evolved toward creating larger interior spaces and more elaborate decorative schemes. This progression shows exactly what we would expect: initial experimentation, gradual refinement, a golden age when resources and skill combine to produce peak achievements, and then subsequent periods where economic constraints lead to compromises in construction quality. But the Osirion disrupts this entire narrative by presenting construction techniques that appear more sophisticated than what came before or after it in the traditional timeline, creating a technological spike that makes no sense unless we're willing to entertain the possibility that it doesn't actually belong to the period to which it has been assigned. The comparison between the Osirion and other New Kingdom construction is so stark that it becomes almost comical to imagine they were built by the same civilization, because New Kingdom temples like Karnak and Luxor were built using relatively small blocks that could be moved by teams of workers using wooden sledges and copper tools, leaving clear archaeological evidence in the form of ramp systems, tool marks, and worker villages. The Osirion employs massive granite blocks, transported from quarries over 100 miles away, fitted with precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. Placed underground with extraordinary challenges, and finished to a level exceeding even the most prestigious royal monuments, all while leaving no trace of the methods employed, no evidence of the workforce, and no contemporary textual references confirming such a project was undertaken during Seti I's reign, which forces us to confront whether the conventional attribution is simply wrong. The specific architectural features that the Osirion possesses include its use of massive monolithic pillars carved from single pieces of red granite that would have required extraordinary effort to quarry and erect underground, where traditional lifting methods would have been nearly impossible. And these pillars support enormous architrave blocks, positioned with millimeter precision to create the stable post and lintel structure. The central feature is a large rectangular pool surrounded by these pillars, suggesting water played some crucial role in whatever rituals the building served. But the design differs fundamentally from other Egyptian sacred pools in scale and architectural treatment. Because typical ritual pools were modest in size, built above ground, and integrated into temple complexes with obvious religious functions through hieroglyphic texts and decorative elements. The Osirion's pool seems designed as the central focus of an entirely underground complex, accessible only by descending into the earth, and devoid of any inscriptional or decorative program that would help us understand its purpose, which creates an interpretive vacuum that orthodox archaeology has filled with speculation about Osirian resurrection symbolism. But these explanations feel more like desperate attempts to force the structure into known religious frameworks, rather than honest admissions that we simply do not know what this building was meant to accomplish. The astronomical alignment of the Osirion has received less attention than it perhaps deserves, but the structure's orientation follows patterns that suggest its builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics and considered the relationship between earthly architecture and heavenly movements to be of paramount importance, as was certainly true for many ancient cultures, but which, in the case of the Osirion, manifests in ways that seem more consistent with Old Kingdom astronomical knowledge than with the New Kingdom approaches to architectural alignment that we see in contemporary structures. The precision of this alignment, maintained despite the structure's burial beneath 50 feet of earth, suggests that whoever designed the Osirion considered its celestial orientation to be non-negotiable, more important than convenience or ease of construction, which raises interesting questions about what astronomical phenomena the builders were attempting to commemorate, and whether that astronomical configuration might provide clues to the structure's actual age, if we could determine when the celestial alignments would have been most significant or meaningful. What the Osirion conspicuously lacks proves just as important as what it contains, because the absence of hieroglyphic inscriptions in a culture that covered every available surface with text represents not merely an unusual architectural choice, but rather a fundamental violation of Egyptian cultural norms that governed how sacred spaces were supposed to be marked, claimed, and explained to both human visitors and divine inhabitants. Egyptian temples were essentially books written in stone, with every wall serving as a canvas for texts that described creation myths, recorded royal achievements, outlined ritual procedures, and invoked divine protection. Yet the Osirion maintains an almost aggressive silence, as if the builders either predated the invention of hieroglyphic writing altogether, or consciously chose to create a space unmarked by textual interpretation, free from the layers of religious and political meaning that later Egyptian culture would have inevitably imposed upon such a significant structure. This absence extends beyond mere hieroglyphs to include any kind of decorative program whatsoever. No painted murals showing gods and kings, no relief carvings depicting religious ceremonies, no cartouches claiming royal ownership, no foundation deposits marking the beginning of construction. Nothing that would allow us to definitively assign the structure to any particular period or pharaoh, based on artistic or textual evidence, rather than the circumstantial and ultimately circular reasoning that places it in Seti I's reign, simply because his temple happens to sit above it. The cultural disconnect between the Osirion and recognizable Egyptian architectural traditions becomes even more apparent when we consider how Egyptian religious buildings were supposed to function as living entities that required constant care, regular offerings, daily rituals performed by authorized priests, and complex bureaucratic infrastructure to manage their holdings and maintain their functions. Every known Egyptian temple comes embedded in this institutional context, with abundant evidence documenting the priesthoods that served them, the lands that supported them, and the theological frameworks that justified their existence. Yet, the Osirion exists in a contextual vacuum, unmentioned in any New Kingdom religious texts, unassociated with any known priesthood, and lacking any evidence of the institutional infrastructure that would have been necessary if it was actually functioning during the New Kingdom period, rather than a much older monument that Seti I discovered and chose to build his temple above, without claiming direct credit, because even he recognized that it belonged to some earlier age beyond his ability to replicate or fully understand. The uncomfortable parallels between the Osirians' construction techniques and megalithic building traditions visible at other ancient sites should trouble anyone committed to the conventional model of isolated civilizations developing independently, because the similarities are too specific and numerous to dismiss as coincidental convergent evolution, especially when these sites often share not just construction techniques, but also astronomical alignments and mythological associations with flood events, and traditions claiming the structures were built by civilizations so ancient that they exist more in myth than in conventionally understood history. Whether we're looking at polygonal masonry at Ollantaytambo, precision-fitted megaliths at the Osirion, or massive foundation stones at Baalbek, we're seeing evidence of technical capability that seems to exceed what orthodox archaeology attributes to these civilizations during the periods when these structures were supposedly built. And the fact that these capabilities appear and then disappear from the archaeological record without clear evidence of how the knowledge was developed or lost presents serious challenges to our understanding of how human technological development proceeds over time. As we move forward to examine in the next chapter how the timeline problems surrounding the Osirion extend far beyond simple questions of architectural style or construction technique, to encompass fundamental contradictions in how we date ancient structures and understand the rise of civilization itself, we must grapple with the reality that the architectural evidence alone is sufficient to raise serious doubts about whether this structure belongs to the period and the pharaoh to which it has been conventionally assigned. Because buildings speak their own language, independent of what textbooks claim about them, and the Osirion speaks clearly and unmistakably of a construction tradition that seems alien to the New Kingdom, incompatible with the known progression of Egyptian architectural development, and more closely aligned with megalithic building techniques that appear at sites around the world in contexts that conventional archaeology struggles to explain, without resorting to increasingly implausible coincidences, and refusing to consider that perhaps our entire model of how and when ancient civilizations developed their most impressive construction capabilities needs fundamental revision rather than defensive elaboration. The official story that Egyptology tells about the Osirion requires us to accept a timeline so riddled with contradictions and logical impossibilities that it begins to resemble less a historical account based on rigorous evidence and more a desperate attempt to force a square peg into a round hole, while insisting that anyone who notices the poor fit must be either incompetent or motivated by fringe theories that threaten the established order of academic archaeology. According to the conventional narrative enshrined in textbooks and museum placards, The Osirion was constructed during the reign of Seti I, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1290 to 1279 BCE, during the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom, a period that came nearly 2,000 years after the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza, and over a millennium after the architectural innovations of the Middle Kingdom had already been developed, refined, and in some cases, abandoned. This dating places the Osirion firmly in a period when Egyptian construction techniques, artistic styles, religious practices, and political organization are extremely well documented through abundant archaeological evidence, extensive hieroglyphic texts, and detailed administrative records. Yet, despite this wealth of documentation from the New Kingdom period, the Osirion stands as a silent anomaly that refuses to conform to anything we know about how Egyptians built during this era. What materials they preferred, what techniques they had mastered, or what cultural motivations would have driven them to create something so radically different from every other structure they built during the same period. The geological evidence examined in Chapter 2 points toward a construction date that predates Seti I's reign by thousands of years, because the water erosion patterns carved into the Osirion's massive stones tell an unambiguous story of prolonged exposure to rainfall that Egypt hasn't experienced since the African humid period ended around 5000 BCE at the very latest, and more likely concluded its wettest phase somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 BCE, when the last ice age was releasing its grip on the planet, and North Africa was still covered with lakes, rivers, and vegetation that would eventually disappear as the climate shifted toward arid conditions. If we take the geological evidence seriously, and there is no scientifically valid reason not to, then we're looking at a minimum age for the Osirion of approximately 7,000 years before Seti I was born, and quite possibly an age that pushes back into a period so remote that it predates not just dynastic Egypt, but potentially the entire conventional timeline for the emergence of complex human societies, with the technological capability to work stone on such a massive scale, with such extraordinary precision, which creates an uncomfortable situation where we must choose between accepting that our entire model of human civilization's development needs fundamental revision, or clinging to a timeline that requires us to ignore physical evidence that speaks with the clarity and certainty that only geology can provide. The architectural evidence explored in Chapter 3 compounds these timeline problems exponentially, because the Osirion's construction techniques, material choices, and overall design philosophy align not with the New Kingdom period to which it has been assigned, but rather with much earlier building traditions that appeared during the Old Kingdom and then mysteriously vanished from the Egyptian architectural repertoire for over 1,000 years, before supposedly reappearing during Seti I's reign in a form that actually surpasses the technical achievement of those earlier megalithic constructions. The idea that Egyptian architects during the New Kingdom suddenly decided to resurrect construction methods that had been obsolete for a millennium, and, moreover, to resurrect them in a more technically advanced form than the original Old Kingdom builders had achieved, violates every principle we understand about how technology and knowledge transmission work in human societies. Because skills that are lost or abandoned for such extended periods don't simply reappear spontaneously at a higher level of refinement without some clear mechanism for their preservation and development. When Roman concrete technology was lost after the fall of the Western Empire, it took European civilization over 1,000 years to redevelop anything comparable through gradual experimentation. And yet, we're supposed to believe that Egyptian builders not only rediscovered techniques for moving and precisely fitting 100-ton stones after a 1,000-year gap, but actually improved upon those techniques to create stonework of even higher quality, all while leaving absolutely no evidence of the learning curve, failed experiments, or gradual refinement that such a technological resurrection would necessarily have required. The cultural evidence presents perhaps the most damning argument against the conventional timeline, because the Assyrians' complete absence of hieroglyphic inscriptions, decorative programs, foundation deposits, or any other form of documentation represents a fundamental violation of everything we know about Egyptian cultural practices during the New Kingdom period, when pharaohs competed to create the most impressive monuments and ensured that their names and achievements were carved prominently on every available surface so that future generations would remember and honor them. Seti I himself was no exception to this pattern of ostentatious self-promotion, as evidenced by his beautifully decorated temple that sits directly above the Osirion, and which leaves no doubt through its extensive hieroglyphic texts about who built it, when it was built, which gods it honored, and what great deeds Seti accomplished. Yet when we descend into the Osirion beneath this same temple, we find absolutely nothing that would connect it to Seti I, or to any other specific pharaoh or time period, as if the structure was deliberately designed to exist outside the normal framework of Egyptian royal construction, where attribution, commemoration, and the establishment of divine legitimacy through architecture were fundamental aspects of how pharaohs understood and exercised their power. The only way to reconcile this cultural disconnect is to accept either that Seti I inexplicably abandoned every cultural norm that governed royal construction during his era to build something utterly unlike anything else from his reign, and then forgot to take credit for it, or that the structure predates the cultural framework that would have demanded such attribution and decoration, belonging instead to some earlier period when Egyptian civilization either hadn't yet developed these practices or operated according to different cultural rules that we don't fully understand. The convenient assumptions that prop up the conventional timeline begin to crumble under scrutiny, revealing themselves to be little more than circular reasoning dressed up as archaeological consensus. Because the primary evidence for dating the Osirion to Seti I's reign is its physical proximity to his temple, which supposedly suggests they were built together. But this assumption only holds if we already believe the Osirion was built during Seti I's reign. And once we question that premise, the entire logical structure collapses. The subsidiary assumptions required to maintain this dating become increasingly elaborate and implausible, including the assumption that water erosion patterns must have been caused by Nile flooding, despite engineering impossibilities, that the archaic architectural style was intentional rather than evidence of actual antiquity, that the absence of hieroglyphic inscriptions represents deliberate design rather than evidence predating such cultural practices, and that Egyptian workers possessed construction capabilities exceeding anything else they demonstrated, but chose to employ those capabilities only once and then immediately forgot how to replicate what they had accomplished. The missing link problem becomes impossible to ignore once we start looking for construction evidence that should exist if the Osirion was actually built during Seti I's reign, because major Egyptian construction projects from this period left abundant archaeological traces in the form of worker villages, tool marks, quarry sites, transportation routes, and administrative texts documenting the workforce. The Osirion has none of this, presenting instead a construction that appears to have materialized fully formed, without the messy reality of human labor that characterizes every other confirmed Egyptian building project. And this absence becomes even more problematic when we consider that Seti I's temple, immediately above, does leave exactly the kind of archaeological traces we would expect, which suggests that if the same workers who built Seti I's temple had also built the Osirion, they would have left similar evidence. Yet they conspicuously did not, almost as if the Osirion was already there when they arrived, and they simply built around something they found, rather than creating it themselves. The broader context of when civilizations rise and fall adds another layer of complexity, because the conventional model assumes more or less linear progression from simple hunter-gatherer societies to complex agricultural civilizations, to sophisticated urban cultures emerging around 3000 BCE, with occasional setbacks, but generally following an upward trajectory. This model has been comfortable for archaeology, providing a neat framework for organizing ancient remains, but it increasingly fails to account for evidence suggesting human civilization's trajectory might have been far less linear, with periods of achievement followed by collapse and regression. Lost knowledge that later generations struggled to rediscover, and possibly sophisticated cultures predating the conventional timeline, but leaving only scattered traces. The work of researchers like Graham Hancock has drawn attention to global patterns, suggesting something significant happened around the last ice age's end, when rising sea levels would have inundated coastal areas where many human populations concentrated, potentially destroying evidence of sophisticated cultures that had developed when sea levels were much lower and coastlines looked dramatically different. The discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to approximately 9600 BCE, and demonstrating organizational capability and architectural sophistication that supposedly shouldn't have existed among hunter-gatherer societies, has forced some reconsideration of how quickly human societies can develop complex social structures, suggesting that civilization's emergence might have been more rapid, ancient, or cyclical than the neat, progressive model that dominated 20th century archaeological thinking. If hunter-gatherers in Anatolia could organize labor forces capable of erecting massive stone pillars carved with sophisticated reliefs 9,000 years before the pyramids, then perhaps we should be less confident about what was possible during periods outside our conventional timelines. And perhaps we should be more willing to entertain that structures, like the Osirion, might belong to periods much earlier than we've considered. Periods requiring us to fundamentally revise our understanding of when sophisticated stoneworking capabilities emerged in the Nile Valley, and whether dynastic Egypt might have been inheriting knowledge that predated the first pharaohs by thousands of years, rather than inventing everything from scratch. The mysterious references in early Egyptian texts to those who came before and to the divine followers of Horus who supposedly ruled in some distant pre-dynastic period have typically been dismissed as mythology with no historical basis, convenient stories told to legitimize royal authority. But perhaps these references preserve actual memories of earlier civilizations that mainstream archaeology has been too quick to dismiss. The sudden appearance of fully developed hieroglyphic writing, sophisticated mathematical knowledge, astronomical understanding, and complex architectural capabilities at the very beginning of dynastic Egypt, around 3100 BCE, has always presented a puzzle, because we typically expect to see gradual development with clear evidence of earlier primitive versions. Yet that developmental sequence is largely missing, almost as if Egyptian civilization emerged already sophisticated rather than developing from simpler origins. And while mainstream archaeology has explained this through models of rapid cultural development or borrowing from other societies, perhaps the simpler explanation is that the first dynastic pharaohs were inheriting knowledge, techniques, and possibly structures from earlier Egyptian cultures that had developed these capabilities over many preceding millennia, but which left fewer archaeological traces because they existed during periods or in locations where preservation conditions were less favorable, or where subsequent building obscured earlier remains. As we prepare to examine in the final chapter what all of these timeline problems mean for our understanding of human history, and why the Osirion matters beyond being merely an interesting archaeological anomaly, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that the conventional dating of this structure to Seti I's reign creates more problems than it solves, requiring increasingly elaborate assumptions and increasingly implausible explanations to maintain a timeline that serves institutional needs, rather than honestly accounting for the full range of physical evidence that the structure presents. And perhaps the time has come to acknowledge that we simply don't know when the Osirion was built. That our current dating methods and interpretive frameworks are inadequate for dealing with structures that fall outside the neat categories we've created, and that the possibility of a much earlier origin for this enigmatic building deserves serious consideration rather than reflexive dismissal based on the assumption that anything that challenges established timelines must be wrong, because it would require us to revise too much of what we think we know about the past. If the Osirion were uncovered for the first time today, with excavators scraping away modern concrete and archaeologists live streaming every find while social media debated it in real time, the reaction would almost certainly mirror what happened more than a century ago. Because while tools improve and documentation becomes sharper, institutional psychology changes at a glacial pace, especially in disciplines where entire careers, reputations, and national identities are quietly scaffolded on a specific version of the past, remaining intact. Archaeology likes to market itself as a hard science, driven purely by evidence. But in practice, it behaves far more like a conservative bureaucracy that rewards consensus maintenance and punishes deviation. Not because anyone meets in smoke-filled rooms to suppress uncomfortable truths, but because funding committees, academic departments, and publishing boards tend to favor interpretations that preserve the usefulness of existing narratives, rather than complicate them with inconvenient anomalies that require costly rewrites of textbooks and exhibits. The Osirion is uniquely threatening, because it does not offer a minor adjustment to Egypt's story, but instead presents a structural contradiction, one that forces a choice between believing that ancient Egyptians suddenly decided to build a massive, undecorated, megalithic, subterranean monument using techniques they otherwise abandoned centuries earlier, or accepting that there may be gaps in the historical record large enough to swallow entire phases of human capability. The moment alternative explanations enter the conversation, the tone shifts from curiosity to defensiveness, and the discussion stops being about stones and erosion patterns and starts being about boundaries, credentials, and reputational safety. With geologists told they do not understand culture, engineers told underestimate ancient ingenuity, and historians quietly reminded that pushing too hard on the wrong question can turn a promising career into a cautionary tale. This defensive posture has been further reinforced by the cultural damage done by sensationalist media. Because once speculative ideas were wrapped in ancient astronaut aesthetics and breathless narration, any serious attempt to discuss pre-dynastic complexity or lost technological knowledge became guilty by association, allowing legitimate anomalies to be dismissed without engagement simply by gesturing toward cable television and changing the subject. The tragedy is that this reaction does not protect science, but actively weakens it. Because when disciplines prioritize narrative stability over evidentiary coherence, they slowly transform from investigative enterprises into curatorial ones, maintaining displays rather than testing assumptions. And the Osirion sits uncomfortably in the middle of this tension, as a reminder that history, like geology, does not care how much effort we have invested in our explanations. When stripped of emotional reactions and institutional reflexes, the Osirion presents a limited set of plausible explanations, none of which are fully comfortable, and all of which demand trade-offs between explanatory power and narrative disruption, making it possible to evaluate them not by how well they preserve the status quo, but by how honestly they account for the physical, geological, architectural, and cultural evidence on the ground. The first and most straightforward possibility is that the Osirion predates dynastic Egypt entirely and was constructed during a pre-dynastic phase that possessed organizational capacity and technical knowledge far exceeding what is currently attributed to that era. An explanation that aligns neatly with the geological indicators of prolonged water exposure, the megalithic construction style, and the complete absence of dynastic iconography, but which also requires acknowledging that Egyptian civilization did not emerge fully formed from simple village cultures, but may have inherited or absorbed remnants of earlier traditions that left few surviving traces. The primary objection to this scenario is not evidentiary, but psychological, because accepting a sophisticated pre-dynastic construction implies that the conventional narrative of gradual development from simplicity to complexity is at best incomplete and at worst fundamentally flawed, forcing historians to confront the possibility that human societies are capable of losing as much knowledge as they gain, especially when environmental disruptions or social collapses intervene. The second possibility, often labeled the lost civilization theory, extends this idea further by proposing that the Osirion is a surviving fragment of a much older global tradition of megalithic engineering that flourished before the end of the last ice age, a hypothesis that gains circumstantial support from striking similarities in stonework techniques found at sites separated by oceans and millennia, but which struggles with the undeniable problem that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And at present, that evidence exists more as a pattern of absences and anomalies than as a clear, continuous archaeological record. This option remains controversial, not because it is inherently implausible, but because it challenges deeply held assumptions about linear progress and technological monopoly, raising uncomfortable questions about how much of human history may be missing due to rising sea levels, erosion, and the fragility of early settlements, while also demanding a more interdisciplinary approach that archaeology has historically resisted. A more conservative alternative places the Osirion in the Old Kingdom, attributing it to an early phase of Egyptian state formation, when large-scale stone construction was at its peak. An explanation that partially accounts for the megalithic elements, while reducing the chronological gap, but which still fails to explain the structure's complete stylistic isolation, subterranean placement, and geological indicators that appear inconsistent with a 3rd millennium BCE construction date. This compromise theory appeals to those who recognize that the New Kingdom attribution is deeply problematic, but are unwilling to push the timeline back far enough to disrupt the broader framework of Egyptian history, resulting in a solution that feels safer but remains incomplete, offering fewer contradictions at the cost of leaving major questions unanswered. Finally, there is the official position that the Osirion was built during the reign of Seti I as an intentional archaic revival, a ceremonial structure designed to evoke Egypt's distant past, an explanation that conveniently preserves existing chronologies, but does so by asking us to believe that New Kingdom builders deliberately abandoned their own well-documented construction methods, iconographic obsessions, and surface-level architectural preferences in favor of a style otherwise unseen in their era, all while leaving behind no textual explanation for this radical departure. This explanation, while institutionally comfortable, resolves none of the geological issues, ignores the engineering challenges of subterranean construction in waterlogged soil, and relies heavily on assumptions rather than evidence, making it the weakest option despite its official status. Regardless of which explanation one prefers, the Osirion generates a set of questions that persist precisely because they cut across disciplinary boundaries, resisting resolution by any single field and exposing the limitations of siloed expertise. Who designed and built the Osirion, and what cultural framework produced a structure so starkly different from everything around it, especially in a civilization famous for visual excess and textual self-documentation? What was its original purpose, and why does it appear more concerned with durability, geometry, and water than with visibility or legacy, suggesting a function that prioritized symbolism or ritual over public display? Why does it lack inscriptions, cartouches, and dedications in a culture that treated writing as a sacred act and rarely missed an opportunity to immortalize its rulers and gods? How was it constructed 50 feet below ground level in an area with a high water table, without leaving behind the logistical debris that normally accompanies large-scale Egyptian projects, such as worker villages, ramps, tool caches, or construction graffiti? Why did Seti I choose to build his richly decorated temple directly above it, aligning his legacy with a structure that already looked ancient by his time? And did he commission it, repurpose it, or simply discover it and incorporate it into his sacred landscape? What happened to the knowledge required to build something like this? And why does it appear briefly and then vanish, leaving later Egyptians to work in smaller blocks, with less precision, despite having greater population density and administrative capacity? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how many similar structures remain buried, eroded, or submerged, waiting quietly beneath layers of assumption and sediment? It is tempting to treat the Osirion as an isolated oddity, a single architectural outlier that can be safely ignored without threatening the overall structure of history. But anomalies are only harmless when they are rare, and the Osirion exists within a growing pattern of sites that collectively challenge the simplicity of our developmental models. If the Osirion is significantly older than claimed, then the story of Egyptian civilization shifts from one of sudden brilliance to one of inheritance and adaptation, raising the possibility that what we call the dawn of civilization may instead represent the recovery phase following a much earlier and largely forgotten chapter of human history. This has implications far beyond Egypt, because similar questions are emerging at sites across the globe where sophisticated stonework appears earlier than expected, where mythological flood narratives intersect with geological evidence of climatic upheaval, and where the archaeological record seems oddly discontinuous at precisely the moments when continuity would be most convenient. It forces us to reconsider the assumption that technological progress is linear and irreversible, and to entertain the uncomfortable idea that complex societies can collapse so thoroughly that only their most durable constructions survive, stripped of context and misunderstood by those who come later. In this sense, the Osirion is not just an archaeological puzzle, but a philosophical one, challenging modern confidence in the permanence of our own knowledge systems, and reminding us that civilization is less like a staircase and more like a tide, advancing and retreating according to forces that do not care about our narratives. The most honest conclusion about the Osirion is not that it proves a specific alternative history, but that it exposes the limits of our certainty, highlighting how much of what we think we know is built on interpretive frameworks rather than immutable facts. Historical confidence is often a product of repetition rather than proof, reinforced by textbooks, documentaries, and institutional authority until it feels immovable, even when the evidence supporting it is thin or circular. Future generations, equipped with better tools, broader interdisciplinary collaboration, and fewer emotional investments in preserving 20th century consensus, will almost certainly look back on our explanations with a mix of amusement and frustration, wondering how so many warning signs were rationalized away. Science advances not only through discovery, but through the slow replacement of assumptions, and the Osirion stands as a stone-built reminder that some questions survive precisely because they refuse to fit neatly into the boxes we have prepared for them. Maybe the true purpose of the Osirion was never ceremonial or symbolic in the way we imagine, but instead serves thousands of years later as a silent provocation, challenging each generation that encounters it to decide whether history is something we investigate or something we defend, and whether our greatest intellectual achievements lie in what we have explained or in what we are finally willing to admit we do not yet understand. The discomfort surrounding the Osirion ultimately reveals less about ancient Egypt than it does about modern scholarship, Because the greatest resistance is not to the idea that we might be wrong about a date or a builder, but to the implication that our frameworks for understanding the past may be fundamentally incomplete, selectively filtered through assumptions inherited from 19th century thinking that equated technological sophistication with moral and cultural progress. Western archaeology emerged alongside colonial expansion, and with it came an unspoken hierarchy of civilizations that conveniently placed modern industrial societies at the pinnacle of a long, upward climb, making it psychologically difficult to accept evidence suggesting that complex knowledge systems may have existed, collapsed, and been forgotten long before written history conveniently begins. The Osirion interferes with this narrative because it refuses to behave like a developmental stepping stone, presenting instead a level of engineering confidence and material ambition that feels unearned by the surrounding archaeological context, like a fully formed sentence dropped into the middle of a conversation that supposedly hadn't learned grammar yet. This creates a kind of intellectual vertigo, because if one structure can exist so far outside its expected technological envelope, then the absence of evidence elsewhere becomes less reassuring and more suspicious, forcing scholars to confront the possibility that the archaeological record is not a continuous archive, but a survival bias shaped by erosion, sea level rise, and the fragility of early human settlements. Most early civilizations likely clustered near water, coastlines, and floodplains, precisely the environments least likely to preserve long-term evidence, meaning that entire chapters of human history may now lie underwater or beneath alluvial deposits, inaccessible not because they never existed, but because we arrived too late to see them intact. In this light, the Osirion begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a survivor, a structure built so redundantly, with stones so massive and joints so precise, that it endured where lighter constructions vanished, leaving behind a misleading impression of technological suddenness when later cultures reoccupied the same landscapes. This possibility reframes Egyptian civilization not as an isolated miracle, but as a culmination, a society that inherited symbolic language, astronomical awareness, and stoneworking traditions from predecessors whose names were lost, but whose influence persisted, subtly encoded into religious myths about divine ancestors and golden ages that historians often dismiss as metaphor rather than memory. The ancient Egyptian references to earlier rulers, semi-divine beings, and followers of Horus may not represent literal gods walking the earth, but they may preserve distorted recollections of real predecessors whose achievements were already ancient by the time writing emerged, much as medieval chroniclers preserved fragments of Roman engineering knowledge without fully understanding its origins. The Osirion's stark minimalism, its emphasis on water, geometry, and axial alignment rather than narrative decoration, suggests a worldview oriented toward permanence and cosmic order rather than political propaganda, hinting at a function that transcended dynastic ego and may have been ritualistic in a way that predates the familiar Egyptian obsession with named kings and individualized afterlives. If so, then Seti I's decision to build his temple above it becomes less mysterious and more strategic, as later rulers throughout history have repeatedly done when encountering ancient monuments whose origins they no longer understood, appropriating their authority by association, while quietly allowing the older structure to retain its aura of antiquity and power. This behavior is not unique to Egypt, as similar patterns can be seen in Rome's reuse of Etruscan sites, medieval cathedrals built atop pagan temples, and even modern capitals that deliberately anchor themselves to ancient ruins to borrow legitimacy from deep time, suggesting that Seti I may have been participating in a long human tradition of inherited grandeur rather than initiating something new. The reluctance to frame the Osirion as inherited rather than commissioned stems largely from the discomfort of admitting that historical agency is not always continuous, and that civilizations often rise atop the remains of others, whose names, languages, and achievements were gradually absorbed, mythologized, or forgotten. Accepting this does not diminish ancient Egypt, but enriches it, transforming it from a solitary peak into part of a longer, more complex human story that includes experimentation, failure, recovery, and reinvention, all operating on timescales that dwarf recorded history and challenge our attachment to neat chronological boxes. The deeper implication is that modern humanity may not be as unprecedented as it likes to believe, and that technological sophistication does not guarantee continuity, especially in the face of environmental instability, resource depletion, or social fragmentation, all of which have ended civilizations before and could do so again. Seen this way, the Osirion becomes a mirror rather than a mystery, reflecting back our own assumptions about progress, permanence, and intellectual superiority, while quietly reminding us that knowledge is only as durable as the systems that preserve it. The stones of the Osirion endured because they were massive, redundant, and over-engineered beyond immediate necessity, whereas the ideas, languages, and identities of its builders may have been lighter, more fragile, and easier to erase, leaving modern scholars to reconstruct intention from architecture alone. This inversion challenges the modern bias toward written records as the ultimate arbiters of truth, exposing how much historical certainty depends not on what happened, but on what happened to survive, and how easily absence is mistaken for non-existence. The Osirion asks an uncomfortable methodological question. How confident should we be in timelines built largely on stylistic continuity when faced with physical evidence that violates those styles without apology? It also forces a re-evaluation of interdisciplinary boundaries, because geology, engineering, climatology, and archaeology all bring valid but incomplete perspectives, and no single discipline can resolve a problem that exists precisely at their intersections. The future of understanding sites like the Osirion likely depends not on finding a single decisive artifact, but on cultivating intellectual humility and collaborative frameworks capable of tolerating ambiguity without rushing to premature closure. Until then, the Osirion will remain what it has always been, not a solved puzzle, but a persistent question mark carved in stone, quietly undermining certainty while resisting assimilation into any narrative that fails to account for its full weight, depth, and strangeness. And perhaps that is its greatest legacy, not as proof of a lost civilization or as evidence of academic failure, but as a reminder that history is not a finished product, but an ongoing negotiation between evidence and interpretation, one that demands curiosity over comfort and skepticism over complacency. In the end, the Osirion does not collapse neatly into a revelation, nor does it resolve itself into a single explanatory framework that allows us to close the book with satisfaction. Because its significance lies not in providing answers, but in destabilizing the confidence with which we believed the answers had already been settled, reminding us that history is not a fixed ledger of facts, but a living construction, shaped as much by what we choose to question as by what we choose to accept. What makes the Osirion so unsettling is not that it suggests a lost civilization or an older timeline, but that it exposes how fragile our reconstructions of the past really are, how dependent they are on survivorship, institutional momentum, and interpretive habit, and how quickly ambiguity is transformed into certainty once it becomes inconvenient to leave questions open. The stones themselves make no claims, offer no inscriptions, demand no allegiance to any theory, and yet through their scale, precision, and stubborn refusal to conform, they exert a quiet pressure on every explanation placed upon them, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that our historical narratives often say more about modern priorities than ancient realities. We like our past to behave like a story, with a beginning that makes sense, a middle that progresses logically, and an ending that leads inevitably to us. But the Osirion sits outside that structure, like an unresolved chord, suggesting that human history may be less like a symphony and more like a series of overlapping echoes, some of which fade entirely, while others survive just long enough to confuse the future. If the Osirion truly belongs to a time far earlier than accepted, then it implies that sophistication does not require inevitability, that knowledge can emerge, peak, and disappear without leaving behind the kind of paper trail modern historians depend upon. And that material, endurance, does not correlate neatly with cultural continuity, a realization that should humble any civilization confident in its permanence. Even if future discoveries ultimately place the Osirion closer to the accepted timeline than its critics suggest, the questions it raises will remain relevant. Because the deeper issue is not the date carved onto a mental calendar, but the methodological reflex to defend timelines rather than interrogate them, to explain anomalies away rather than allow them to challenge foundational assumptions. The real danger is not that we might revise the past too radically, but that we might refuse to revise it at all, mistaking institutional stability for intellectual rigor, and mistaking repetition for proof, while quietly sidelining evidence that refuses to cooperate with established models. History advances not when mysteries are solved, but when the boundaries of inquiry are widened enough to allow unsolved mysteries to exist without being ridiculed, ignored, or prematurely neutralized. And the Osirion demands precisely this kind of intellectual patience, standing as a reminder that uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, but a natural consequence of honest investigation. There is a certain irony in the fact that a structure buried underground for millennia now functions as an exposure mechanism, revealing not hidden chambers or artifacts, but the fault lines within modern academic thought, where confidence hardens into dogma and curiosity is quietly subordinated to consensus. Perhaps future generations, armed with new technologies and fewer emotional investments in preserving 20th century narratives, will see the Osirion differently, not as an anomaly to be explained away, but as a data point in a much longer and messier human story. One that includes forgotten chapters, interrupted traditions, and cycles of achievement and loss that challenge the myth of linear progress. Until then, the Osirion remains suspended between categories, neither comfortably Egyptian nor convincingly foreign, neither fully explained nor entirely mysterious, occupying a liminal space that mirrors humanity's own uncertain relationship with its past, caught between the desire for definitive answers and the reality that some questions resist closure. And maybe that resistance is the point, because monuments like the Osirion do not merely preserve stone, they preserve tension, carrying forward the unresolved complexity of human history into the present, where it can continue to provoke, unsettle, and inspire those willing to look beyond the surface of accepted explanations. If there is a lesson to be drawn, it is not that we should abandon established knowledge in favor of speculation, but that we should treat certainty with caution and curiosity with respect, recognizing that the past is not a solved puzzle, but a landscape still being mapped, with vast regions unexplored, not because they are inaccessible, but because we have grown too comfortable with the maps we already possess. The Osirion endures not because it confirms what we know, but because it quietly insists that what we know is provisional, contingent, and subject to revision. And in doing so, it fulfills perhaps the most valuable role any ancient structure can play, not as a monument to answers, but as a monument to the enduring necessity of doubt.